one of my favorite metaphors for me and how I say it is life is a pendulum, and you need to keep exploring both sides to find where the middle is. And I think that's the case with Mello. He is one side of the pendulum, but also is like setting massive goals for yourself and taking big action. So I really like to now respect those two phases of my life, and realize that actually distress comes from when you're resisting, like when you're in the middle and you're like, things are great. And you're actually like resisting swinging to each side, which is going to happen naturally. The same as day and night happens, and sort of the same as the seasons happen, you have to have these natural changes.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Lewis and Kyle Show. Lewis and Kyle Show is an interview podcast that my friend Lewis and I started back in 2020, where we interview entrepreneurs, investors, creators, authors, and people just generally living high leverage lives. We've interviewed something like 85 people in the bank, if you want to go listen to those. All of them are evergreen. We try to keep everything not current so that you can enjoy it whenever you please. Today, we have a great episode.
Completely agree, Kyle. I really enjoyed interviewing Tylah McConnell in today's episode. Tylah is an author, so she fits into one of those categories you've discussed, but she's also a midwife, which is someone we have not had before. First midwife on the podcast. Can't believe it took us 80 episodes to interview a midwife, but we got there. Tylah is also an entrepreneurial midwife, so she's slowly working on kind of building her own practice so she can avoid a lot of the really damaging and not harmful, but challenges of working for like the medical establishment as a midwife, where they set your hours, they set your appointments. It's really, really, really hard, and from her experience, kind of miserable. So she's building her own practice to be able to have fewer hours in the traditional establishment and more hours and more intimate relationships with a smaller number of clients. And we get into that just a little bit. She's also an author, like you said, of the book 18&Lost, which is co-authored by two other past podcast guests, Joe and Scott. It's a really awesome book. There are 9 cool entrepreneurs in Australia who kind of took alternate life paths, or in their late 20s, and they're giving the advice they would have wanted to receive when they graduated high school at 18, so they don't make the same mistakes. It's a really cool book. I've been enjoying reading it. I really enjoyed Tylah's chapter especially. She's also an Instagram, YouTube, and TikToker on this midwife content. Some pretty bizarre stuff there that I would highly recommend checking out. This conversation covers a lot. We cover Tylah's really remarkable self-awareness that just kind of blew both Kyle and myself away. We get into her ideas on masculine versus feminine energy. Of course, we discuss the book. Of course, we discuss her midwife business. And we also discuss how she uses dating as networking. There's a lot of gems in this conversation. I'm excited for you to listen. We'll switch over to it now. Enjoy. Quick disclaimer for this episode. We had a bit of a technical challenge with the recording. Since Tylah was in Australia and Kyle and I were in the US, there was a bit of a delay between her talking and us talking, which led to it sounding like we interrupted her in the last 2 to 3 seconds of every time she started talking. There's a slight degree of overlap. Kyle and I did not interrupt her every single time she started talking. It just kind of sounded that way, and it really doesn't obstruct the episode. I just wanted to make a disclaimer that does happen, and not to be alarmed. Thanks so much. Welcome to the Lewis and Kyle Show. Hyped for this conversation. Thanks for being here. We did a podcast a few weeks ago with these guys, Joe and Scott. If y'all haven't listened to this episode already, I'd encourage you to. But Joe's world famous for his idea called the 1,000 doors, which you meet one person that brings you into a hypothetical room that opens to doors that lead to another room. You never know where that will lead. So Tylah, fortunately, someone who came into our world through Joe. And so that's a pretty interesting concept. I want to ask you, first of all, how you kind of got into that group and met Joe, because I know that's a big part of the book that you're releasing.
It actually is maybe one of the most interesting stories, and one that I absolutely love to tell because it's a bunch of fun. So for me, it all started with actually a right swipe on Tinder, which seems unsuspecting. But I right swiped, well, first, it's really interesting. So I right swiped on Scott. We'd matched on a few apps, but never really got the conversation going. And eventually he's like, I'd
right swipe on Scott too.
Engineer. I haven't dated one of those before. Let's give it a go. That was sort of my jump in. Little did I know, he's sort of very far from that currently. But it all started with that right swipe. And I remember even before the first date, I was like, can't really be bothered. Not really into it. But at that time when I was actively dating, I had like a no flake rule. And I thought, that's good dating karma. Like if I never flake on anyone, put that karma out there. So I was like, going to flake, going to flake. Then I was like, nah. And I ended up turning up. I really saw dating as a way of networking. So as a midwife, I work in a predominantly female orientated industry. And I saw dating as a way to create, of course, looking for that romantic partner if you so happen to find it. But I really saw it as an opportunity to network, and especially network with men. And I tried to date as many different types as I could, in terms of just like learning about what they did and their life stories. I found that to be like a great time in my life. So I ended up meeting up with Scott, and we went for a bit of a bushwalk, and he was listening to this book called Awareness by Anthony DeMello, which Joey, is also very fond of. And I had just finished that book, and I was like, amazing. So we dated for a little bit, and it was so fascinating to learn about Scott. He really is a force. We say, Joey describes him as like a bit of a bull that you've got to sort of just let run off the cliff. He'll keep you in conversation for 3 hours or more. And then through that, we figured out he's very logical minded, that very engineer type. I'm, very emotional, intuitive, and it didn't really work compatibility wise, but we both had this desire to, do something greater than what is considered a traditional life, to do something, innovative and fun. So we thought, well, actually, we can offer each other a lot in terms of being opposites. Let's stay in contact, let's stay friends. And then he said, hey, I think you'd be perfect. I'm having this retreat. Really didn't say what it's about. Sort of mentioned school system. He was like, are you keen to come along? And I was, working that weekend, but I decided, you know what? I need something like this in my life. So swap my shifts around, and I was there. And that's when I was introduced to Joey and all the authors of the book.
So what was this retreat that you guys went on, and what happened during the retreat?
So the retreat was kept quite a mystery, but it was essentially along the lines of, we're going to do something with schools, maybe write a book. That was like the preface. And knowing Joey better now, I know that he likes to keep a lot of things secret, or misrepresent things in a way to sort of get you in, and then chuck something out of left field. That's really his style. So when we got there, we essentially were run through a workshop by Joey and Scott, and a lot of it were Joey's concepts from his blog about how to live life, the 1,000 doors concept, audience of none. So what would you do if nobody was watching? Sort of the idea of the pleasure treadmill, like once you get on it, and if you're unconscious about it, like you're just going to keep wanting more and more and more. And so we went through a series of these workshops, and we drew out, our life story, told our life story. Originally, the idea was to interview a bunch of people each, and then compile that into a book. But then we realized, hey, our stories are just as relevant and just as unique. And it's almost better to have the story of the everyday human, because that's especially what people who leave school want to hear. They don't want to hear about the entrepreneur who's already made millions and millions of dollars, because it seems so far out of reach. Instead, they just want to hear about people that are doing cool things now that may be a little bit different than normal.
So I'm trying to figure out exactly how I want to put this question together. So during that weekend, do you write the book, create a draft? How does kind of this seem like it was a half-baked idea from the host of the event at the beginning of the weekend? How does it mature into a book that's, being published the next week or so?
I think the idea was that, what is, the minimal viable sort of way to write a book? I think sometimes when we do things, we almost talk ourselves out of it, by being like, writing a book, that seems impossible. That's many years of work. I'll do it in my free time, that sort of concept. Rather than like, how about we do it in a month? That's all we've got. What can you come up with in a month? So we set all the dates. Okay, everyone's to write this chapter in a month. Then we come back together, see what we've got, and go from there.
So the premise of the book, from how I understand it, the title's fairly helpful in that it's 18&Lost, so are we. Then you have these 8 or 9 co-authors sharing their stories of their life paths. So let's get into your chapter. Like, what is the lesson you're imparting to, these prospective 18-year-olds who might want to go a different way in life? Like, what's the message and the story, obviously, that you deliver in your fraction of the book?
So my chapter's idea is really about self-abandonment, and how we often abandon ourselves in order to please others, put simply. But also sometimes we abandon ourselves for what we think is best for ourselves. So how this really played out for me is, in high school, I didn't really know what I was going to do. I was really interested in concepts like psychology, didn't really know, but I knew that when I was little, I had this pregnant Barbie doll. And I loved to do pretend births, and I absolutely loved the idea of birthing and pregnant women. It was just this thing I always thought about, and a fascination. But I thought, oh, that's really weird for like a 10-year-old to be thinking about. I remember like getting my parents' computer, and YouTube had just come out, and like secretly watching births and like treating it like basically a teenage boy who's seeing porn for the first time, like so secretive, delete the history, that sort of thing. So I sort of pushed that away and didn't really think about it. But then I was just sitting in like roll call, and a girl, we'd always ask each other, oh, like, what are you going to do? That's the most common question, facing 17, 18-year-olds. What are you going to do when you finish school? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Um, and I sort of learned that this wasn't really, people weren't really interested in what you were actually going to do. They just wanted to weigh it up with what they think you should do or what they would want to do. It was never actually a genuine interest. But anyway, this girl at the time had said, maybe I'm thinking about being a midwife. And for me, it was like a lightning bolt. Like I had been struck, and I said right then, that's what I'm going to do, and I'll do it for the rest of my life. So I think I was very lucky in having that certainty, but it didn't mean I didn't face challenges. So what I ended up doing is I went on a student exchange through Rotary. And Rotary has the idea, so they're for the community, and they essentially want to create better international relations. They've helped end polio and things like that. Their whole motto is service above self. And so I went to Sweden for a year, and this was massive for my development. I'd say it was like the hardest year of my life. Because I went into like Australian culture, weather always good, everyone genuinely friendly, and I didn't know that Swedes were so determined by, like, they were so controlled by the weather. So I went January, the middle of winter there, like no one would talk to me, couldn't make friends easily. But it also made me realize, wow, had I been, born into Sweden, my whole life would have been different. They had different customs, different cultures, and different traditions. And I was just like, wow. The biggest thing that really struck me as well is my host mum at the time, like she had this really sort of important job, and my host dad's job was still important, but he did mainly all the cooking and the cleaning. And he was more of that, I guess, maternal figure. And just to see that play out was so fascinating. And that really made me realize, wow, I actually have a choice to how I want to live my life. So I came back to Australia and started my midwifery degree. But like something wasn't clicking. I didn't like how it was done. At uni, we were sort of fed this idealized version of what birth was like, and then to see the hospital system and how it was a complete opposite. And I remember I handed the papers in to defer, like I was going to leave uni, but my mum said, if you leave, I'm going to kick you out of the house. And how it sort of works living in Sydney, very unaffordable for uni students. Most people will live with their parents until they finish uni. So I was like, I don't know, I didn't even know how I would like live on my own or rent. So I stuck with it, and she's like, you'll thank me on graduation day. But then during my time at uni, I was still looking for an escape. And that's when I found a lot of personal development, entrepreneur sort of concepts and business, because I didn't want to be trapped by a system. So that really led me to just completely expand my mind to what is possible for me. And then I finished uni, and I did, in fact, thank my mum on graduation day more for having completed something and I guess having plan B. Whether, that's the right thing necessarily, I don't know, but I was grateful to have been like, well, at least I finished something, and from then I can do postgrad education or something like that. So there's this job in midwifery where you work on call and you have a caseload of women. And in uni, this is preached as the gold standard of care, because women who have the same midwife are less likely to have a premature baby, are less likely to need an epidural, are less likely to have a stillbirth. Like, how do we measure these things? Why does just having the same care provider do that? We really don't know, but that's what the research says. So I sort of had fixed myself that that's what I would do, and it's a little bit more alternative. Choose your own hours. You don't have to do shift work in the hospital. And so I worked towards that. And then, like most times when we set a goal and we have big expectations for it, it often very much fails to meet that. So I actually found at that time that it was highly stressful. I committed my whole life to the job. I hadn't learned boundaries. I hadn't learned these essential skills that you need to know in life through my uni degree about, where does the line between work and, personal life, and how do you assert those boundaries without feeling guilty. I had very like codependent tendencies where I felt responsible for the women and their outcomes when, that simply can't exist. And then, I actually remember a time where I had worked on call 27 days straight without a break. And I was driving my car like down a highway. And I was like, what if I just turn my car into the cement barrier? Like, I don't want to go to work tomorrow. I don't want to do this anymore. And that was really like a low point of when I realized I had to change. And that I couldn't work like that anymore. So I started, thinking about other ways to work. And it's very uncommon for a midwife, but to be using social media for education and to be looking at different ways to, both improve the system, improve women's outcomes, but also a better way for me to work. And so that's when I ended up, creating my own business and forming online content.
That's an extremely interesting story, and I know that we're going to dive deeper into the midwife part of it, although Lewis and I's understanding of it all is definitely limited. I want to go back to this self-abandonment issue. What misunderstanding in young people and just people in general do you think makes us prioritize the wants, the needs, the priorities of other people above our own selves and our own priorities? And what do you think this like? Is there a common solution? Is it a common misunderstanding?
I don't really think we're ever taught how to listen to our inner voice or how to listen to ourselves. I think, we go through school, that's all regimented. We know what class is next, what assignments are due, and it's all at the account of someone else. The same for high school, the same for exams. Everything's sort of presented in front of us, and then we're taught to react. I think, being proactive is not really focused on. And some could say this is the remnants of sort of an industrial society where they're taught to be good workers and, that's what you're sort of trying to train. But I think it also goes on like people wanting the best for you and everyone wanting to give you these opinions. And I love what Joey says, that all advice is bad advice because people give you advice they wish they gave themselves rather than advice that is individualized for you. For me, I think how it presented was really being responsible for other people's feelings, wanting, my parents to be proud of me, or, wanting to do things similar to my friends. Now that I'm working in Outback Australia, so it's the very centre, Alice Springs, it's one of the most isolated towns in Australia. And essentially, I've been able to learn a lot more about Indigenous culture. So Indigenous people have this concept where they will sit on the ground for hours and sort of stare into space. And us looking in on that, we might be like, what are these people doing? Like, what on earth, some people might, see it as unproductive, but really what they're doing then is taking the opportunity to connect, their mind, body, soul, spirit, and listen to the messages they sort of get, listen to their intuition. And that really opened my eyes of like, how often are we left undistracted without social media, without, going to work, driving here, going to the gym, doing this? How many gaps do we leave to sit and stare into space and listen to what our intuition is telling us?
Yeah, I really like the concept that you brought up there about, being responsible for other people's feelings. And like how out of control that is actually to you. Like you can do everything right in the pursuit of making someone happy, and someone cut them off on the way home, and like your whole day is ruined because they didn't react the way that you wanted them to, right? And like I think that that's really essential to like making good relationships with people, is just removing those expectations entirely. But it's a lot easier said than done, obviously. Like, I'm not good at it. But I think it's important for this self-abandonment issue and, like, treating yourself like you're someone that's worth being taken care of, and, like, that you're responsible for yourself. And that you're the person that can actually make a change in you. Like, you can't make somebody feel anything, but you can make yourself feel something, right? And it's like sort of backwards. And so this next question that I've got for you is a little off the wall, is a little different. I sense that you're a very emotionally intelligent person. I think that your job probably, you have to be. I mean, I think, I don't know anything about it, but it's got to be a very emotional business.
I've heard childbirth is stressful.
Right. What emotional misunderstandings do you think that there are between men and women that are common but like not widely understood?
Kyle, you don't know how well she's prepared for this question. I listened to her on Byron's show, masculine energy versus feminine energy. She's about to just
knock this one out of the park. Let's hear it.
So yeah, like I was saying, you hit one of my absolute favorite topics in the world. Working as a midwife, you are privy to what is sometimes the happiest day of a couple's life, or sometimes the most devastating. And you're really privy to how relationship dynamics completely can affect a whole birth experience. So the biggest thing with birth is that it's a mental game. Not a lot of it's physical. You can measure obs and measure things, but a lot of it can't be measured. It's still completely out of control. The medical system has tried to, bring in some control, but that's always led to worse outcomes. We know any medical interventions sort of that aren't necessary can lead to worse outcomes. So that sort of, I guess, was my initial insight into the fascination between men and women working generally with heterosexual couples, but also not forgetting to remember that, I do work with same-sex couples as well. So I talk a lot about feminine and masculine, and my interest came from dating and really never having it sort of go right, and really starting then to build a fascination of like, why do we struggle to understand each other so much? And really then looking at the two different types of energies, because we know men and women are different, and it's good to accept that. I know we're definitely looking for equality, but that is a different sort of thing. Yes, looking for equality of rights, and equality of pay, but still understanding that we work and operate very differently. So for me, the feminine sort of represents this free-flowing, nurturing sort of spirit. I like to say that the woman is the river and the man is the river bank. I also want to extend that there are exceptions to this, and you can have a feminine man and a masculine woman, and that still works really well. But I'll just talk in sort of that general sense for the conversation. I think one of the big things is that men feel loved by having sex, and women need to feel loved to have sex. So I think that is a really big difference. And how I try and explain it, and to my understanding, it's in the same way women feel these intensities of emotion, men feel the intensity of sexual desire. And when I realized this, it really allowed me to understand and appreciate men a lot more. I know with a lot of these movements coming out, and so they should be brought to life, such as the Me Too movement, it's important to, note that there are definitely times when that goes wrong. But I also think now it's almost gone too far that men are so scared to embrace that side of sexual desire, and really accept it as part of their masculine, that, we are seeing a lot of then issues then in these relationship dynamics of, men not taking the lead. So I like to say, and this is for my own personal preference, that, in my relationship dynamics, I like the men to lead, but be informed by me, sort of thing. So be informed by the feminine. So it's almost like the woman is the neck and the man is the head. And that's really just honing on those natural masculine and feminine energies. So a good example of this would be just decision making. So, there's that infamous argument that couples, always argue about what to eat. And it's always a big issue. What are we going to eat? What are we going to eat? And it's sort of like the man listening to like how the woman's feeling and her preferences, but ultimately just making the damn decision, because they are much better at goal planning, strategizing, sort of being focused on projects, and getting that tunnel vision. And what we like to say, let's say like women have, thousands more thoughts than men generally, and that makes them a lot better at being that sort of task orientated, goal orientated. So, it's understanding that there are going to be these differences, and it's not criticizing them or trying to change each other, but rather respecting and understanding the differences.
Yeah, I think that's a good breakdown of, again, I think a lot of people have become afraid to even make the general statement, men and women have differences. I think you do a really good job of handling that and like explaining, obviously there's exceptions. Just, I think the way someone like Jordan Peterson, if you're familiar with him, might explain that, because he's gotten in a lot of trouble for making very similar kind of descriptions of some differences. He's like, if you handed a personality test to 1,000 men and 1,000 women and each had them take this personality test, you can predict the outcomes will be different on that personality test. Then, if you look at FD data from every individual who took the test, yes, you can say they're more likely to be this way because they're from that group. I think you do it in a way that respects, the difference of every individual, while being like, yes, there's overall trends that are really, really interesting there. One question I have for you that you've kind of wasn't even on my list of questions before the podcast, so that's how you know it's a good question. You just demonstrate a very high degree of self-awareness. One, just in speaking of like your own preferences and like your own values, and also your own personal weaknesses that you've seemingly overcome over time. How do you brought up sitting and staring into space for 4 hours, and this was going to be the question I asked if Kyle didn't jump in there. Do you sit and stare into space for 4 hours? Like, what are your do you sit down with Joe for an hour and he exposes these things about you? What are your practices, advice for kind of realizing a lot of these limiting beliefs that you've had in the past and have seemingly periodically overcome?
So the biggest way I actually love to do this is not alone. I am much like a creature of, wanting to interact with people and learn about people. So my biggest way to do this is actually just ask really important questions to people. And by listening to them, you also are able to develop your own sense of like how you would answer the question. So I think genuine curiosity of how other people work is a big way that I like to do it. One of my favorite questions that I used to ask on dating apps all the time was, in regards to a person's work. Because, we get asked like, what job do you do? Whatever. That's a really boring, basic question. We know that. But I would ask, what about your job do you know, only because you do the job, that all of the population should know? And this was such a great way for me to specifically like learn, get sort of the insider secrets on careers and people's jobs without being exactly like, what is your job? Getting more out of it than, passing a judgment on someone based off their career, but also, based off their answer, it's that real mirror and reflection of like, okay, like they value that and they see that as important. What might I see as important? But I think it's having those really important conversations. And I would also say, just that constant mental dialogue of like, how does this feel to me? So a lot of my self-awareness comes through emotion and really being able to identify my feelings. So it's just that stopping and reflecting on your feelings, but also asking into space. So not necessarily doing it for 4 hours. That might seem a bit crazy, but I always ask the question, like, what's the next right thing for me to do? And sort of just sit and wait for the answer. And it always does come.
I think that's really solid advice, and you don't need 4 hours. Again, this is like what we were saying about the book to people, right? That if people think, oh, I'm going to write a book, and then in their heads there's this, oh, I'm not going to do that. That's a year. I need all this time. And it's the same thing with kind of encouraging people to take some space for just a little bit of quiet, undistracted introspection. And you don't need to sit for 4 hours to get the benefits of that. I promise, if you sit in a dark closet for 10 minutes, it doesn't have to be dark or a closet, but preferably quiet, with one question, and your only priority is to sit and let the answers come, that will be useful. And you don't need a lot of free time to do it. At most, 10 minutes is the last I counted for how long it takes for 10 minutes to pass. I have another question for you, kind of unrelated to everything we've brought up so far. Are you still a 5:30 a.m. person?
That is an excellent question. So one massive thing that came from writing the book was meeting Marvin, who then introduced us to 5:30 Club. So he was one of like an original club founder. So for 6 months straight, I did the 5:30 Club prior to moving to Alice Springs. So moving to a new location, we're actually launching a 5:30 Club Alice Springs this month. So definitely getting started. And I think having the opportunity to do it for 6 months and now having sort of 3 months off, I am able to reflect and realize just how much value it added to my life. So sort of to relate that back to the self-awareness, the biggest thing for me is just chucking myself into like really random experiences and always saying yes. That inherently is going to make you more self-aware. So for me, it's like, doing midwifery in Africa, going to Sweden, moving to the outback Australia, like all of that is going to,
Can you explain a little bit about the benefits from the 530 Club that you're missing now?
So for me, I really do struggle with personal accountability. As much that right now I'm living in nursing quarters, and when I clean my room, I get like one of the girls to come and sit and watch me clean my room so that I'm cleaning it. I really use my friendships as an opportunity for accountability. So I do group working out and make sure that my friend's going and I'll meet them there. That's really a strategy I found for myself. So in terms of 530 Club, it was that I had that guilt of like, if I don't go, I'll be letting a friend down. And that always forced me to go. There is no way on this earth would I voluntarily get up at 5:30 in the morning on my own, ever. And so I think for me, like it was just that 1 hour, and I would often even do it before a 12-hour shift at the hospital, which is what I was working at that time, because it just gave me that hour to myself. And it seems silly, but sometimes all I would just do is a post on Instagram for my business. And it seemed like a really small thing, but unless you actually set aside that time to do that every morning, even though it takes 5 minutes, it just doesn't become a mental priority. And I've significantly noticed that now, like when you're just holding yourself accountable, oh yeah, to post it, but then like no one's there, holding you accountable. It never happens. It never does. So for me, it was a way of, again, connecting with community in the morning and using that as a form of, in a way, productivity. But I wouldn't say sort of like that toxic productivity of, oh, I must be successful, but rather like these are things I want to do anyway.
Well, let's go into your business and your
club.
social media profiles and what you've been able to build, I guess, since that moment when you were driving home and you were like, I mean, what am I doing? I don't want to go to work tomorrow, and then figured out, this business. So why don't you talk to us about what the business is, and what you're doing with it now, and
basic business model,
how you've grown your TikTok following to what, 20 million views and 3 million likes, right? It's incredible.
Yeah, it's been insane. Yeah, so for me, it was really about making the decision that I wasn't happy. And that's being honest with yourself. I think that's one of the hardest things. But my top number one value above all else is honesty. And that's honesty with my friends, like calling it out as it is. But more importantly, honesty with myself. So it was admitting I am not happy here. And once I sort of made that choice and put in my resignation, I think it's important to recognize that there's that time of recovery where my main focus was cutting as much out of my life as I possibly could. The only goal I had was to create space, nothing else. So, it was ending, it was ending a domestic violent relationship that I was in that time. It was ending like CrossFit, which for me was like way too intense to keep up with. It was cutting that out. It was cutting out friends that I felt obliged to see. And that's, all I did at the start. I was like, I just want to create space. I just want to create space. And then from sort of nothing is where you build. I think the biggest lesson that I learned was that, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. That's reflected in the 530 Club and especially in this book, that then I started to surround myself with people that held me accountable, that, gave me that nourishment, that inspired me, that I had those amazing conversations with. And that was really the catalyst to it all. I think we're very much taught this concept of aloneness in Western culture. And again, to compare it to what I've learned about the Indigenous community is, if the Indigenous community sees someone on their own, it's almost seen as that person's like mentally ill. Like people shouldn't be alone. They should always be together in communities, with family. It's that concept of like, you think you have to do it all. You have to, get your finances in order. You have to build your own business. You have to do all of this. But realizing that that is such a struggle, that is such hard work. And you know what, when you do it with people, it comes naturally. It feels so much more intuitive. It's almost
So
effortless,
to
I would
ask
say.
a more specific version of the question, I mean, great context. I don't want to say you didn't answer the question. I want to get additional answers. Let's talk about TikTok specifically. So have you felt it's effortless? Have you been strategic about it? Did you have, X goals for followers, X goals for videos per week? Or are you just like, I went to work today and someone asked me this question about, should mothers eat like there's two people or only eat an extra 200 calories? And I feel like everyone should actually know about that. What's kind of the side of the spectrum and the strategy or lack thereof, and more on the intuition side, just with TikTok?
So I'd say, leading on from that concept of creating space. So once that space was created, I was actually able to figure out what I wanted to do. And for me, I have this saying, high hopes, low expectations. So I've learned that expectations always will come back to bite you. Always, always, always. So, but that's not saying don't have any goals and don't have any desires. You can be hopeful, but just to see where it goes. So with TikTok, I literally had been making YouTube videos when I was a midwifery student. So nursing culture, midwifery culture have this idea of eating young alive. And I found it was really challenging in training, faced quite a lot of bullying. And the outlet that I had was like, I want to educate midwifery students so that they don't have to go through the same thing. Give them strategies to deal with difficult midwives, give them information. So it started like that. But then I thought, why sort of stop at midwifery students when there's all these mums out here? You don't have to get a license to have a child, yet the actions that you take in parenthood will completely alter like a human's life. To me, that is insane. Like you can just get pregnant and suddenly, with no education, no information, sort of be responsible for an entire lifetime. And I really thought more people need to know. So similar to what you said, and similar to that question that I always ask on dating apps of like, what do I have specific knowledge on being a midwife that everyone needs to know? And that was really an easy premise to create videos. So I just started to chuck a few up, just cuts from my YouTube, just to see where it went. I personally had learned so much from TikTok. I'd enjoyed TikTok. So I was like, let's chuck a few up. And then I think within the first sort of 5 to 10 videos, suddenly one went crazy viral. And that was when I was on a TV show called One Born Every Minute, which is about, babies being born. But that went crazy. And I was like, wow, now I have this incredible audience. Like, how can I best serve them? Then also through that, on the business side of things, I actually then had baby companies reaching out, and one particular startup who wanted to work with me. And essentially their whole premise was like, we don't want to like make you commercial. We don't want you to have to like advertise products. All we want to do is add value to our women, and that's your only job. And so that was something that I really aligned with, because no one wants to be that sort of sellout. And especially working for the government, you have to be super careful with how you do things. But knowing that they didn't want that from me, that they just wanted, me to do Q&As for women, and, answer their questions, things like that, that really aligned. So it was sort of weird how when you create space and you just put stuff out there without expectation, that, again, you open those doors for yourself, and it's almost like what you put out comes back to you, but it's never instantly. And I think this is why people have a lot of problems with creating things, because it's like an Instagram doesn't grow overnight, a TikTok doesn't grow overnight. You just have to keep putting it out there, and you never ever know what's going to land. And that's the craziest things. Like the videos that go viral for me are like the ones that I was like, oh yeah, I'll just quickly do that one. Like it might be, it's a weird idea. And then suddenly that's my biggest one. And I would even say that you can relate that back to life, is that like for me, again, with that date with Scott, I had no expectations of like, I was sort of just like, oh, maybe, whatever, we'll see, I'll just go on it. And suddenly, it turned into the most amazing thing. And I think Joey's posted this thing recently that that says we often get what we want when we stop wanting it. And I think that is super valuable. So again, with my business, that success and those followers haven't come from me like busting, having this content planner and I must reach this views by this time and all these goals. for me, that gets me really in my masculine energy, that I sort of want to, my inner child wants to rebel against that. I'm like, I don't want a strict schedule for myself. I honestly just say, okay, when I feel like there's an important topic, I'll make it. And I don't put that pressure on myself. And I actually find that way I am,
That's an idea
more
I heard
excited to
on
make
a
it, more
recent
excited to
podcast
do
I
it.
was
And it
listening to about
happens
some
a
of the
lot
most
more effortlessly.
iconic creators on the internet. There's obviously counterexamples, but some of the most iconic creators on the internet, like Wait But Why and Tim Urban, for example, he doesn't release content on any predictable schedule, but every piece he puts out is a mega hit because he only releases it when there's some massive point he has to make. I mean, you can make the alternative example, someone like David Dobrik on YouTube, who had like a weekly vlog for a very long time. I think that's kind of the difference. So like Kyle and I, for example, with an interview podcast, now getting into like a whole unrelated explanation, but the source of entropy, the source of randomness, like as it's easy to do a good weekly interview podcast because you just bring on someone else who's interesting. And like that is the source of kind of environmental randomness that like leads to consistently interesting content. But as someone like you on TikTok, which is like, you asking yourself, what do I know that the world needs to know? Okay, it's Tuesday. I need to come up with something, right? Like you can't repeat it. Like you can't always have something good to say every Tuesday. And so the fact that you've kind of waited for that intuition to strike for when you post seems like it's really made a positive impact. Now, I want to ask you, I have two more questions I want to ask. I know how many more Kyle has. One I want to ask you is about Mello specifically. So if anyone hasn't read Awareness by Anthony Mello, which I would have never heard of had it not been myself a member of this kind of 1,000 Doors friend group or whatever we want to call it, with Joe as the community philosopher. But how have you put DeMello into kind of your life? Because one thing you said that stuck out to me was kind of acknowledging that you're unhappy. And that kind of seemed like a contradictory idea to like a very DeMello kind of philosophy. So what's your kind of like, because that book really rocked my world when I first read it. So how do you bring that book into your life in some various ways? And how did you find it?
So, ironically, I was actually given it by an ex-partner who's sort of like, I think you should read this. And it took me a while to get into it. So I used to just keep it by my bath. And every time I had a bath, I would just read a little bit. And I didn't really realize the true value, I think, until I hit the middle. And then I had to for hours keep filling out the bath to make it hot so I could get through the book. And then from there, I used to listen to it every night before I went to bed, sort of just 20 minutes, as a bit of a clearing of the mind. I think some feedback I got from Scott is Tylah, you're almost too self-aware in that you keep looking the devil in the eye and you keep focusing on your flaws and you keep trying to be I know I have problems with this, I need to fix it, and this is this. So it really gave me the ability to let that go. And I really sort of like to say, just to stop worrying, stop that constant worrying in my head. And how that, I guess, sort of came about is now I always have this phrase, everything works out, best case scenario. So I sort of will repeat that to myself several times a day, especially when I'm stressed, because you find actually, what might seem stressful at the time has taught you something valuable or has led to something even better. So it allowed me to let go of the outcome and sort of just enjoy the journey and realize that, whilst it may not feel good now, it's definitely going to feel good later. And so then I would like to come to the point of, you said admitting that I wasn't happy. I really like to say that life is sort of between expansion and contraction, like the flight of the bird's wings. You need both to move forward. So I think you do have to oscillate between sort of that, I'm not happy, I need to take action, versus I just need to glide and enjoy what's happening right now. And I think when people really get themselves in a tizzy or unhappy is that they'll be going on a really good roll, doing all their exercise, smashing their goals. Suddenly, the switch flips and they can't get out of bed. They're not, and then they almost make it go longer and they get angry at themselves because they're oh, but I used to be able to do this. I was doing this for so long. And they're really resisting that time for contraction and to actually come in and reflect, on the period of growth they just had. So one of my favorite metaphors for me and how I say it is life is a pendulum, and you need to keep exploring both sides to find where the middle is. And I think that's the case with DeMello. He is one side of the pendulum, but also is like setting massive goals for yourself and taking big action. So I really like to now respect those two phases of my life, and realize that actually distress comes from when you're resisting, like when you're in the middle and you're like, things are great. And you're actually like resisting swinging to each side, which is going to happen naturally. The same as day and night happens, and sort of the same as the seasons happen, you have to have these natural changes. And what I found interestingly, is even with like a woman and her menstrual cycle, it happens for 4 weeks, and each week you've got completely different hormonal things going on, and each week you should really be doing different exercises. If you work out, you should be doing different things to optimize your hormones at that time. Whereas a man, their testosterone cycle is that 24 hours time. So I guess they can sort of, work their day towards that.
This has all been incredibly
interesting.
I've really enjoyed listening to your answers, and I think you're an extremely clear thinker. Well. This has been very, very cool. My next question. So I got 2 questions. Lewis's dogs are barking. He sent me his question. I will relay that to you shortly. I'm not going to talk to many midwives probably until it's like time. What can I do? What are like 3 things that men should know about like birthing and the whole experience? like how could I be like the best in that like period of time?
So this again is one of the most interesting conversations that I could have, and something that I learned recently actually from a same-sex couple that I'm looking after, is that actually they've found that when men have been introduced into the labor room, which has only sort of been since the 70s and 80s, we've actually seen a few more difficulties. So at times more increased intervention. And why this is because in a labor room, the man, rightly so, goes into his masculine and he's like wanting to protect his woman and wanting to save her from the pain. You'll hear, get her the epidural, get her the pain relief. They really see that as their role, rather than actually, I guess, taking that step back, that idea of surrender, and really respecting how powerful their partner is and how, with the right mindset, their partner can do this. So through TV, and especially, I guess, what a lot of men's understanding will be, is that birth is so scary and so dramatic and so terrifying, and there's blood and guts and everything like that. But one of my favorite sayings is actually, a baby should be birthed in the same environment it's conceived in. All those same hormones are at work. So, if you're having sex with a woman, like, do you want a doctor in there measuring your heart rate? Oh, is he doing it right? Is the erection long enough? Is it good enough? Oh no, he's failing. And these are sort of words that are used with women, like she's taking too long, she's failing to progress. And it's really going against nature. When left, to have sex in a room with no interruptions, with some nice music on, candlelight in the dark, it's a lovely time. And birth can also be that way. There's been multiple times, especially at home births, where I've seen women laugh their babies out, have the best time. Yes, it's difficult, the same way as running a marathon is difficult, yet we don't, stick morphine into marathon runners' veins. We appreciate their struggle and we appreciate their effort. And this is not to say that I believe all women shouldn't have intervention or pain relief. 15% of cesarean sections are life-saving. And I also believe if a woman is, in a lot of fear, maybe doesn't have the best relationship and isn't in that mental space to have, a birth that can be full of surrender and enjoyment, then of course they can be used to amazing, extent. But I think really focusing on that time to, first of all, learn about having a baby, learning about how hormones work, learning that actually having the lights off is important because that stimulates melatonin, which stimulates your oxytocin, that actually you should be, making out and increasing your oxytocin, massaging your partner, and really, talking about your love for your partner to make her hormones work more successfully is an important thing. I think a lot of men go into birth being like, what do I do, right? Masculine, very like, what's on my to-do list, goals, how long, how many centimeters is cervix? And of course, we love men for that, always sort of having a plan and keeping logical. However, really, I say to men, all you have to do is be there and actually be present with your partner, and don't like let yourself run away by being like, get her the epidural, or run away mentally in fear. Just being like, I'm with her through all of this, giving her encouraging words, having that eye contact, having that touch, and like no matter what, I hold steadfast and present.
Question.
And that's really the most amazing
Rough
thing
estimate,
that they can do.
how many babies do you think you've delivered?
So one thing in midwifery is we love to say that pizzas are delivered and babies are birthed. And we really like to put the power back to the women, that they birth their own babies, and we are simply there to either catch or just sit on our hands and watch them catch, and sort of be the facilitators. For me at this stage, it would definitely be in its hundreds. And I think that's so cool. They sort of say, you've made it as an ED nurse when you can do CPR without getting adrenaline up. And I feel the same now. Like,
that's awesome. At least I had the forethought to acknowledge was
the head's there, the baby's about to come, and just be really nonchalant that I've sort of made it.
One thing I wanted to say earlier, first of all, I think that's really, really helpful advice for any man. And again, comes back to the things that only you would know having sat through hundreds of these and seeing people make mistakes that have really not helped anybody. So thank you for sharing that insider expertise with us. I just wanted to say on your Mello answer that's kind of spoke directly to kind of the experience I've had, where I had a very intense last couple of years of college of very go planning, increasing my capacity, and doing a poor job of coming to terms with a very relaxed summer of not having any dramatic challenges and a insane sense of progress and all those things. And hopefully now the pendulum's going to go back the other way, but maybe wanting it to go the other way is not the lesson. But that kind of put the situation I'm in some terms I hadn't thought through. So thank you for that. I do want to ask a couple more book related questions, since sticking to the plan, right? Sticking to the plan. But one thing I'm curious about, because, the book's not 8 or 9 authors, not just you. What is something that you learned from another author that kind of changed the way you've approached your life since the retreat, or since reading the drafts, or just one other example besides just you sharing your story that you were affected by the story and the ideas of another author?
I think Joey is an incredible answer, just sort of a nice, easy answer to go with it, but also very true in that all his concepts on his blogs, all his metaphors he speaks in, have completely been life-changing. And, even when I'm, going through a hard time, he's got his podcast with just 10 minutes that you just realigns you. So I think it's easy to say that, and I will definitely noteworthy. But I think for me, a big one was Gab, who is our youngest author and was 18 at the time of writing it. And I think just seeing her, and I think almost recognizing my younger self in that, but knowing that my path, I got too scared, I stopped listening to myself, and I sort of took the long way. And to be able to see her now and continue to encourage her, you have these massive dreams, go after them, girl. Don't let anything sort of stop you. Don't let any outside influence affect you negatively. You've got this hunger, and that hunger and creativity is unique, and understanding that and believing in that and seeing where you can go with that, definitely for me, was a big learner. And just realizing, I think you learn more by putting your time into other people and helping them out, rather
Kyle,
than directly for yourself. You
okay,
always learn more indirectly.
Every question I've asked has been a winner.
I've been writing a bunch of stuff down.
I'm ready to cash out and feel like a winner.
I mean,
I've got so many notes.
I'm definitely
notes
kind of blown away, Tylah. Honestly, I did not do enough preparation for this conversation. I knew you were going to be awesome because of Joe, but I'm very impressed with your ability to answer these questions in a way that is, Joe-esque. And so I really enjoyed this, and I really appreciate you for coming on. I mean, we could talk longer, but I think it's a good place to end for sure. Where would you like them to go to learn more about you? And the book, obviously the book.
So firstly, of course, firstly I would say yes.
And you can find her with that, because
definitely.
your Instagram didn't have your last name, so it took me a minute to figure out your last name.
_Tylah,
trying to find your TikTok, and I searched up Tylah Midwife,
on
and it came right
TikTok
up.
and Instagram.
I was like, oh no way, this is
YouTube.
sweet. So you've reverse engineered my psychology to be discoverable online. So props to you there. But I think we'll tie it up here. Thank you so much.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, guys.
And that wraps up our interview with Tylah, another really incredible episode. And, I know I said it in the interview a couple of times, but I was just blown away with the clarity of thought and the delivery of some of those like larger metaphors that she just kind of like rolled off the tongue, or like cliches that you need to hear again and again. So my takeaways were, number one, her emotional intelligence. I think that it's probably just been built over time through delivering babies for like women. Like, I know that wedding planners have like a really like good grasp on psychology and how to like deal with people, because these girls are like in their highest level state of like wanting everything to be perfect. And I can only imagine that in the delivery room, it's probably way different. Obviously, I don't know anything about that. I'm just saying she's probably learned a lot about emotions through her experience, and that shows.
Yeah.
Right. She's catching babies. Number two is the idea of being too self-aware, and how she, basically identified that as a problem within herself. Is like, I think about how I breathe too much or whatever, like, and some of that can have really negative outcomes, and I've experienced that myself without really giving it a name. And so I just thought that was interesting. And then number three, something that I've thought about a lot since the podcast, is just the idea that contraction and expansion are sort of intertwined, and how you can't really expect to just grow forever. Like, that's just not the way the world works. It's like a bird flapping its wings. You've got to close the wings in order to open them again. And, that spoke to me in the season of life that I'm in now, and just how, you can be patient, and that the expansion will come again at some point. And so, yeah, those are my takeaways. Really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you, Tylah.
Great stuff, Kyle. Those were all things that were great that I didn't write down, so I appreciate that. One thing I think Tylah does really well and really emphasized was embodying knowledge versus just having knowledge. This is kind of a really important topic for the genre of podcast that we're in, right? If you're hearing all these ideas and these principles and these ways you should live and ways you should act, or, consider acting, that's great. But if you don't actually embody those principles, if you're not, using that really helpful way of thinking, once you encounter the situation where that way of thinking is like only ever useful, it's like you're not embodying that knowledge. There's not really any value to that. So if she can, speak really clearly about her emotional states, but then that doesn't actually help her make braver decisions, right? She's not really embodying that knowledge, but seems that she does embody that knowledge. And that was a really big point to me. So kind of this is something we talked about in like an episode in the mid-40s with Talger, was kind of like integration, right? Just like, how do you integrate ideas into yourself? And my second takeaway is kind of like a point she talked about there, which is developing the ability to listen to yourself. That's something that she talked about from kind of, I don't want to screw up the words here, I'm just going to walk carefully, the indigenous populations in the outback in Australia. She said like they have some really powerful traditions of just sitting alone for like 4 hours and staring into space, and that helps you develop the ability to listen to yourself. And she kind of, didn't talk about how she does that to that extreme, but it's similar things: undistracted thinking for long periods of time, practicing being unstimulated, meaning you don't wake up and check your phones immediately. You can, if you're eating by yourself, maybe you just eat, right? You just like eat the food. You don't have like the TV on. You don't have like really intense, demanding music playing. You're just kind of sitting with your own thoughts. And like you discussed, her emotional intelligence is probably developed through trial and fire of like watching women in extremely stressful situations. She's probably also put a similar amount of practice into developing that ability to listen to yourself, which I think leads to integrating some of the ideas, because you just get hammered over and over with what you should be doing, and eventually you become that way. Third thing was the kind of value bundles you get when you join a community. I don't know how much we talked about this versus something that always kind of happens to me in the conclusions to these podcasts. I'm like, I don't know if this is an idea I had while researching this episode or from actually the episode itself. But anyway, Tylah was really active in the 5:30 a.m. club, something I believe we discussed a good bit in this episode. And she discussed kind of all the different benefits that one decision had. So kind of that value pack, if you will. She met really great friends. She developed really great habits. It gave her time to work on her business without getting in the way of her schedule. It led to meeting people. That led to all of the projects kind of discussed in this episode. So I just moved to a new city, And really, it doesn't even matter if I did, right? It's like extremely valuable to join communities. If I joined a fitness community, it's like get my fitness covered, learn a skill, stay in shape, XYZ, meet people that might lead to writing a book at a retreat. That's what I have to say about this episode with Tylah. If you want to support us, I wrote down the ways in advance so I can rattle them off more quickly this time. Subscribe on whatever platform you're on. If that's YouTube, if that's a podcast listener, hit that sub button. Share this episode with a friend. That's really helpful to help us get new listeners. That's something that we really appreciate when that happens. Listen to more episodes. We got a ton of episodes. There's like 80 other episodes. You can, wherever you are, you can probably find those without too much effort. I'd encourage you to listen to another one. And you can say hello on social media if you have a message for us. You like this episode, you don't like this episode, you think we should interview you, we should interview your cousin, we should interview someone else, whatever. Just we'd like to hear from you. So that's what I have to say. We'll see you in a week or so with the next episode. Bye-bye.